What's happening, folks? We're back with the next piece in day 4 of our classical days journeys, and we're going to listen to another work by Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky. And I did want to quickly mention there's been someone who's been asking for the first piano concerto of Tchaikovsky. I want to assure you, before we get to the end of this classical days voyage, I am going to react to that, likely on the final day of my classical days experience, and I will explain why that happened when I get to it. So yes, bear with me for a couple days longer, but that really is coming. In the meantime, we're going to listen to what Tchaikovsky stylized as a fantasy overture, but which is fundamentally a symphonic tone poem, and that is Romeo and Juliet. So yes, another work based on Shakespeare's legendary play. This went through some different versions. We're going to hear what Tchaikovsky eventually composed as the third and final version, and I think the first version he did was over a decade before, so it went through some different iterations, and there's a particular history to that, but ultimately the final version is the one that has become well known and still performed regularly in today's 21st century classical music repertoire. I've seen it performed live multiple times, including the Pacific Symphony Orchestra, or the PSO. They used to do this summer tour, and they would always do a performance at this open-air theater in Irvine. It doesn't exist anymore. They tore it down, and there's now, like, I think, apartments or condominiums in its place, so it's a bit of sad local classical music history. But the point is, they used to do a Tchaikovsky spectacular at the end of this summer concert series, and I went to it multiple years in a row, and this piece was played not in each season, but in a couple of the seasons over the course of several that I saw. So I have seen this performed live, and yes, it's quite lengthy, so I'll try not to talk too much longer. I think it's like 19 minutes long, so we'll get to it, but I did want to mention about halfway through, and I think it maybe comes back a couple times, but there's this melody that is used in shows and movies, in many cases when there's two lovers who are, feeling each other's adoration and love, in some cases, on a rooftop about to kiss. This particular melody from this fantasy overture has been used in such cases multiple times. I know I've seen it in a movie, and in fact, when I first heard this performed as a full piece, I remember hearing that part and thinking, oh wait, I've seen that in a movie, or I've heard that in a TV show before. So yes, there is a very famous section of this work for pop culture, never mind for the significance of this piece in the world of classical music. So we'll get to it. This is Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky and his Romeo and Juliet Fantasy Overture, and it is performed by the Philharmonia Kosovia and conducted by Johannes Waldner. 20 minutes. Didn't feel like 19 minutes to me, but it is in fact done. So yes, it's got everything, right? It's got drama, it's got worry, it's got mourning, which you hear not quite right at the end, but close to the end. You can feel the sense of loss, and Romeo and Juliet both having passed, and the Montague and Capulet families realizing that their petty feud may very well have spoiled the next generation of their families, and not only broken their hearts individually, but across the streets of Verona. You can feel the action, the intensity, and there's that part in the middle which I was sort of like enjoying the drama and the timpani in that part. Notably, I feel like that is maybe the battle between Romeo and Tybalt in the streets, which again is sort of the real threshold, like can't go back sort of moment in the play. And of course, there is the lovely, rich, and pure, innocent romance between Romeo and Juliet, and that theme does come back in a couple different moments and a couple different arrangements or iterations. Again, I have this very distinct memory of that famous love theme playing in some film where two people are on the top of the Empire State Building and they're kissing. So yeah, I don't know in the moment what film it is, but I really feel like I have a very specific memory of hearing that in a particular film. So yeah, I suppose I could try to figure it out, and maybe some of you will be familiar. Either way, it's a very sweet and loving melody which fits that nice aspect of the story before it gets distorted and thrown away by the cruel twist of fate, the stars that are crossed for Romeo and Juliet. So yeah, it's got everything. I love the string work. Of course, I love the timpani. There's harp in there. There's some real nice moments with the woodwinds. So yes, it utilizes the orchestra well. It's a great piece. Shout out to not only Tchaikovsky, but the Philharmonia Kassovia, as well as Johannes Wildner. And yes, ultimately, I have more pieces coming this morning, so I'll see you in a moment for the next one. Peace.